Hello and welcome to Hessens County. I'm glad that you could join us again today for another TTRPG Talk. This video series discusses tabletop role-playing games, related materials, and design. Today's entry will be a continuation of our SRD series with a look at Personae. This system was originally released by Craig Hatler Games back in summer of 2022. It underwent a 2.0 refresh not that long ago that includes graphic-based reference cards and other aids that really help with sort of like the comprehension of the system, some of which will be used in the background of this video as we explore the basic concepts of this system. We will go into discussing the mechanics in just a bit, but first let's take a look at the sort of design philosophy, at least as far as I interpret it. Like a lot of other role-playing systems that are more on the meaty side, but are still independent of a setting, Personae attempts to embrace a wide variety of possibilities that exist in storytelling. The system does this by trying to provide a wide variety of robust tools that are constructive for a large number of different use cases, like providing different types of enhancements, systems for tools, for powers, for magic, and all kinds of stuff like that. It also uses a unique language to describe certain elements of the game to strengthen Personae's link to the sort of theatrical and dramatic origins of role-playing. The clearest example that I've seen of this so far is referring to the game's referee as the chorus instead of using the usual terminology of game master, MC, or storyteller. A reference to a group of actors that were commonly utilized as a tool in Greek drama. The chorus were a group of actors who together represented a group of background characters that together, and often through song, provided extra information and context for both the audience, but also would occasionally interact with the major characters. Not only does this reference to Greek drama reinforce the idea that the referee needs to play a wide number of characters as in the storytelling, as many GMs do, right? But it also reminds everyone at the table that the chorus is there to support the players and the identities that the players are taking on. Also, it emphasizes the fact that the primary source of the action and conflict in the stories being told using Personae should be coming from the identities that the players are controlling and not from the chorus. Now, you might have noticed that I said identities instead of characters. This is because, technically, in Personae, anything that mechanically acts on others or can be acted upon can be treated as if it were an identity. Obviously for the players, this would normally be like the primary player character and potentially some secondary characters that they might need to take on from time to time. But identities for the chorus will more frequently include groups of characters, significant objects or phenomena of opposition, and other things that again are acting against the player characters, or that the player characters are reacting to, or acting against, right? So now let's take a little bit of a look at some of the mechanics that drive Personae. Um, this is certainly not going to be comprehensive because, as I mentioned, this is definitely a more meaty system than some of the other ones that we have covered previously. So I am not going to be diving that deep into some of the more nitty-gritty, crunchy stuff. So instead, we're going to be doing more of a more casual look into things. Normally, the core sort of mechanic that you're utilizing whenever you are using Personae is in a sort of issue and answer style challenge. Both of the players that are representing the identities involved, right, are rolling, and their roles are acting against each other. So this is an oppositional role system, where basically the character who wants to initiate the action, like the player, basically decides what it is they're going to roll and how they're going to do it, and then usually the chorus, of course, would decide what the identity they're controlling is going to do in opposition to that. Also, just to go ahead and throw it out there right now, this system is primarily built around the idea of using a sort of 10-sided dice with it. but obviously this is the default. You could potentially make a modification to this whenever you are creating a Personae game and maybe utilize a different dice system instead. Whenever you're creating or using an identity, there are basically two major elements that you need to keep in mind. We have attributes and we have traits. Attributes are some of are very similar to attributes that you might find in other game systems, in that they primarily utilize or they're primarily attempting to describe these sort of innate, physical, mental, personality qualities of the identity in question, of the character in question. One other thing about attributes that is important to keep in mind if you're attempting to design a Personae game or play a Personae game is that whenever you're creating your character or developing your character, improving your character, right, a character advancement, is that attributes can be increased, but they have to stay within a certain range of each other. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the math of that in this video, but that is something to keep in mind, is that there is a structure in place that keeps you from overdeveloping your character in certain areas, basically unbalancing your character. There's a certain basically function source in there that does at least attempt you to keep your attributes, you know, relatively in line with one another. I'm not necessarily going to be diving too deeply into the actual character creation of Personae today, but the main structure of how you create your character is primarily based on point buy systems. So that's something else that is important to note. We're not rolling dice to decide your character. You're making very intentional choices on where you're going to be allocating your certain resources at character creation. And also, obviously, further on when you're actually developing your character. Uh, Base Personae does start off with 6 attributes. They are all 6 listed here. Again, I'm not going to go too deeply into them. They do not line up with your typical 6 attributes that you might have from a game like D&D or Pathfinder or whatever, in that they are pretty distinct and different from one another. There are some where you could potentially draw a bit of a line across. Like you could make the argument that stature is a bit like like sort of like a strength and constitution kind of rolled into one. Or you could make the argument that cunning is got certain elements of charisma and dexterity and stuff in them, but other ones they're just completely different. So it's you're going to need to learn as sort of like the specifics of what these are each describing as you play and create a game or character in Persona. So as I mentioned, whenever you're creating an identity or utilizing an identity in Personae, there's going to be you're going to have those attributes that we mentioned, but then you're also going to have traits. Traits are essentially an umbrella terminology that we use to describe a wide number of different items that might exist separately in other role-playing systems. Um, just to kind of jump through them here, we have skills, enhancements, powers, and talents. And then also the vitality, which is kind of like your health, also falls under traits technically. But we're not going to discuss that in any real depth today. So just to kind of go through these real quick, skills, they don't operate the same way as your skills might in like Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, where they're essentially adding a modifier on top of whatever you're rolling. Instead, it's actually the other way around, in which the skill actually sets the number, or the skill or the power or some other thing like that is normally setting the number of dice you need to roll to determine exactly what happens, and your attribute is actually adding a bonus. We'll go a bit more deeply into that in a little bit. But yes, as I mentioned, skills are essentially as it says here, the foundational basis for performing your action. So like I said, this is determining the number of dice that you roll. Many of these skills, there is not necessarily a set list. So you could potentially customize the list of skills that are at least standard for your game. either when you're creating your game or your characters, you can have the players basically pick out the particular skills that they think would be particularly important for, or maybe you'll have like a list of skills for a class, right? Or a character concept, make a set of character concepts or classes that maybe those will have skills attached to them, or at least some of them. And then your players could pick others. There's lots of different ways you could potentially do that. Some other traits that I mentioned were enhancements. Enhancements essentially make other traits better, um, or at least make certain actions you do with your traits better. We have powers, which again, this is essentially just like a blanket that we have for like mutant, supernatural powers, magic, uh, any types of things like that. You could potentially add mechanics that limit the number of times you can use certain powers and stuff like that, but otherwise it's basically assumed that your characters can use these things at will, or at least a certain, like in the fiction you might be able to use them only a certain number of times, but that's primarily decided at the table. Um, the actual Personae structure does not limit that, because again, this is a blanket thing where these powers could be used. Maybe this is, psychic powers, magic, like I mentioned, um, supernatural abilities. Maybe your characters are playing aliens that have really weird powers that don't really fit into your normal humanoid form sort of uh, default. So these could cover a lot of that kind of stuff too, like shooting lasers out of your eyes. I don't know. Talents are certain traits that do not necessarily fall into some of our other categories that we've mentioned so far. So these talents are like abilities, like concentrations of knowledge or skill, um, or resources that your particular character has the ability to utilize. So, for example, an important talent could be speaking a language. An important expertise might be that your character is really knowledgeable and skilled in horticulture. A resource might be that maybe your character is a noble, and so therefore they have access to certain like monetary resources, or certain maybe that your character um, controls a mine, right? Or they own a company. Or other different sorts of things like that, where they might be able to tap to draw resources from to assist them in their fiction, or to create opportunities for certain things to happen. Those are all things that could potentially fall under this blanket. As I mentioned, vitality is another thing that does exist here. I'm not going to dive deep into that, but this is essentially like um, your character's health. The way health works in this is you take a certain number of hits, and then those hits start to affect your. It gives your character shock levels, and those shock levels reduce the base number of dice that you're rolling whenever you're attempting to do an action. And obviously, the worse that gets, the fewer dice you're able to roll, until eventually get to the point where you've essentially been knocked out. You'll notice whenever you take a look at a Personae character sheet, or at least like the default one that comes with the system, because Craig Hatler did create like a full set of character sheets to go with this system. You'll notice that there really isn't an equipment list necessarily, or a section where you can write that kind of stuff down. That's because, as we mentioned earlier, if you have major resources that could potentially have a major impact on sort of like the narrative, that already exists under the traits with under the sort of talent resources. Um, Anything else, it's typically assumed that you at least have the basics of what you would need to be able to do certain things. Um, if you need something that is ridiculously above what would normally be accessible to your character, that is when you would be potentially utilizing resources. Yeah, things you might have acquired over the course of your fiction, and then used development points, which essentially are like experience points for Personae, to actually augment your character with them. So those again would kind of fall under talents, um, either in or some sort of trait, like giving your character a power because you have a certain item, right? A certain magical item, let's say. If you have a weapon that's of particularly potent um, craftsmanship, right? Then maybe that would fall under an enhancement that would modify your the various combat skills that you have, stuff like that. As I mentioned, this is Personae does utilize a D10 pool system that is oppositional. You as the character, you as the player character would normally be rolling more than one dice. Um, and then usually the person who is responding would either roll the number of dice that they would need to roll if they are a player character, or if you're the chorus, then you would usually roll whatever the identity you created would roll, or you just roll one less than the player did. Um, when you roll, when you roll your pool of seven-sided dice, you will usually pick out the highest value one, and then you would add the attribute modifier. If you are the chorus and you're rolling something that does not have like a modifier to it, like for example, if I'm trying to pick a lock, all right, that's not really an identity. So normally you would just roll one less dice than the other person did, and then you would just be adding or subtracting um, from your die roll depending upon how difficult you think the particular action was. Um, anyway, what you would do is you roll, you pick out the highest level dice. So here in the example on the card, the active player, the actor, right, rolled a four dice and got the seven as their highest. The attribute that they're using gives them a +5 bonus, so they get a 12, which means they succeed, right? The the sort of reacting character rolled a highest value die on their pool, but because their attributes were lower, it's +3, they got less, right? So, and again, the identity with the higher roll ends up winning the challenge. If there is a tie, you then go to the next highest one. Assisting whenever you're doing a challenge is very similar to the way it works in a lot of other role playing games, and that basically you determine who's helping who, and then you just essentially are adding extra dice to the pool of the person who is the primary actor. So that's how that would kind of work. Um, Criticals, you can have critical successes in Personae. Basically, whenever you end up rolling a 10, a 0, right? You can bank critical successes and apply them to certain things later, like giving you a bonus on a roll later, giving you an automatic success on things later, um, adding an effect that is specialized to a certain power or enhancement that your character might have. Um, dealing extra damage whenever you're attacking somebody. All of those are different things that you could potentially that utilize a banked critical for. And again, there's a maximum limit to the number of things you can bank, which is primarily related to your sort of potential threshold. Potential is essentially like a class level. Whenever your character becomes more powerful, you can also bank more criticals, which means you can do more cool stuff. So that's just how that kind of works there. That's probably about as far as I'm going to necessarily go today. There is a lot of stuff that we could potentially dive into. This is actually only part one of two of the different sort of PDF slideshow things that Craig Hatler created to sort of help flesh out sort of the way Personae works. As I said at the top of this video, Personae is a rather crunchy system that does have a lot of tools that you could utilize for a wide variety of sort of settings and game types, but I would not necessarily recommend this. I would definitely feel that this is really, really built for like long-term play. This is not really necessarily ideal for short games, quick pickup games, one shots. That's not really what this system was written for. This was written for long story form campaigns, I feel. But because it's designed towards that, and because of the way that like the different sorts of traits work, allowing you to essentially simulate uh, a wide variety of different things, all potentially existing in the same world at the same time. I feel that this is really useful for creating the sorts of style of storytelling and games that you would need to in order to be able to incorporate a lot of those things together into one world where other systems would potentially break down. Um, Like, I feel like this could probably honestly do D&D better than D&D does, at least when it comes to like the magic system, when it comes to the because of the wide varieties of different types of magic, right? When it comes to the wide variety of different types of like supernatural powers that certain characters or classes have, I feel like this would potentially be able to utilize some. I realize what I'm saying is extremely controversial, but I feel like in some ways that sort of like the Personae system could utilize those a little bit better. I feel than like the basic structure that like let's say especially third edition D&D from my memories of it could do. Um, Probably pretty interesting to anybody who's either wanting to create their own game or for a group that wants to potentially play a game that mushes a lot of ideas together into one sort of like multi-world, right? A multiverse exploration sort of a game that would be really good for this because you would still be rolling the same dice no matter what, no matter where you are. If you're pulling in magic and psychic powers and weird advanced sci-fi stuff, technologies and aliens and all of those things combined together, it Persona has the tools that you could definitely simulate those different things in it. So definitely check it out. Links to the Personae SRD can be found in the doobly-doo down below on itch.io. And also any other relevant links that I find, like other games that games that are already utilizing the Personae system, you can also find down below. Don't forget to rate your itch purchases. Do have a good zone, and we'll see you next time. If you would like to show your support for this channel or for the Hessens County blog, in the description down below, you will find links to the channel coffee and also the itch store. Please feel free to take a look, and thank you for your support.